Hey everybody, welcome back for another video. Today we're talking the Colonial Apocalypse, because as I've been looking into the early colonial periods of a lot of different sites, there are certain patterns that keep reappearing, and I'm starting to think we're looking at a large scale destructive event described away as many different things. So today we're gonna look at a few more sites, have some fun, and we're gonna start in Australia, because I think as we look at a few different sites and a few of the different narratives, I think we can start to see a clearer picture. So what I wanted to do is start with actually Hobart in Tasmania, and there was some interesting finds underneath a car park of all things. And underneath this car park in Hobart in Tasmania, they found these cottages, and this is roughly where the car park would have been. Fair enough, but just a little details. Archaeologists have uncovered conjoined cottages, and they're putting it to the early to mid 1800s, hidden underneath the car park in Hobart's central business district. And what else I wanted to point out about this particular excavation site is that they found these two cottages, and they each had two of these fireplaces, basically these larger red bricks associated with this particular site. All right, so we got these two cottages, conjoined cottages with these two fireplaces, but they're basement level fireplaces, according to the history here. Fair enough. What I want to do is just keep that in your mind. We're going approximately 370 miles or so north to Melbourne, Australia, and we're gonna look at some of those buried blocks of Melbourne, because there's something interesting that I came across that ties into the site we just looked at. Now, the buried block phenomenon of Melbourne, I think it was back in 2017 or thereabouts, when archaeologists started uncovering whole neighborhoods that were buried. And this was, I think, in 2016 or 17. So they went back into the records, and according to the history, the street level was raised approximately 5 or 6 feet throughout the central business district of Melbourne. But they only rediscovered that in 2017. So that's the official history. But I believe it was last year they found another one of these buried blocks on Bennett's Lane. And the interesting thing about this particular site is that visitors to this site, they can see the remnants of two of these pre-Gold Rush era cottages. So two cottages built in the 1840s. So very similar time frame to the last site. And we're looking at cottages again. And both cottages have two almost perfectly preserved red brick fireplaces. So going back to the last site in Hobart, you had, again, two cottages. They're putting it roughly same period of time, and they each have two of these red brick fireplaces. But the difference is, in Hobart, we're being told these are associated with the basement. And in Melbourne, we're being told this was actually the ground floor at one point, and the city council determined that they needed to raise the street levels. So here they're not associated with the basement. Back in Hobart, they're associated with the basement, but they're from the exact time, according to the history, they're from the same time period. Basically, conjoined cottages, both with red brick fireplaces, but completely different narratives. So I guess I'm just thinking maybe it's the case with this site as well, that there was an event. Because I speculate with the buried blocks of Melbourne, the whole narrative that city council raised the street levels, I just don't believe that. But again, that's my speculation. And I just want to point out, before I leave the buried blocks of Melbourne, there was this hotel called the Historic Hotel. And I've touched on this before, but it appeared to be a 2-story hotel with a basement. And in 2014, there was an archaeological excavation around the structure, because there was speculation that the basement was once first floor. People were speculating that the ground level was lower. But prior to 2017, people weren't aware of the the raising of the streets. And an archaeological team came in 2014, and they determined that there was no evidence found that the basement was ever at street level. But after the rediscovery of the buried blocks of Melbourne, and after it was determined or found that City Council raised the street level, the Heritage Council, they determined that indeed the basement of the historic hotel actually was at one point, it was street level. So this 2-story structure with a basement actually was a 3-story structure, and ground level was lower. So I just wanted to mention that. But going back to Hobart, there's another place I want to look at called the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery. And the interesting thing about that is back in 2008, again, another colonial discovery, about 2 meters below ground, they have found evidence of sandstone vaults. So I guess the speculation here is that stone vaults at one point were ground level, but we're just being told they're basements, they're vaults, it's a cellar. That's my speculation. And this particular museum and art gallery, it's not even a mile away from that site that was buried underneath the car park. So pretty much all within the central business district of Hobart. And there was another area in Hobart called, I think it was like a district called Wapping. I'm not sure the exact location of it, but it's somewhere here in the central business district. But this district that used to be called Wapping, they found a lot of these early to mid 19th century dwellings, so this early colonial period, all at a depth of nearly 2 meters below existing street level. And again, I'm thinking street level was actually lower, approximately 2 meters. And it's not that these are all sub-level structures, it's that the ground level was lower. And if we actually jump to a different site called Port Arthur, it's a historic site, and it's in Tasmania as well, and it's about 40 kilometers or about 25 miles away from Hobart, where we were just at. But this was a penal colony, we're told, and I think it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but it's in a state of ruins, and it appears partially buried in places. And there has been excavations undergone at this particular site as well, and they're finding more of these buried levels associated with this site, and there's the appearance of all this clay. And I should mention, a lot of these sites, especially in Australia, it's clay that they're finding. So during these excavations, and again, so they were excavating this particular area, and they were associating it with workshops. I think they thought there would be a blacksmith here as well as a foundry, but they're associating it with this time frame. It's always this time frame, at least when you're looking at Australia, but it's this early colonial period. And from this article talking about some of the excavations, they found this orange clay. And what I wanted to bring up is that there were very few artifacts recovered from the clay itself, and that indicated to the archaeologists that it had been laid down as a single event rather than different stages of occupation. So it appears that all this clay that they're finding on top of this workshop area was laid down during one event, and I think that might have been a destructive event. But underneath the clay, they're finding things like anvils just buried. So when you look at it, like, what is causing this right here? Why is it buried under this clay? And you go 25 miles away to Hobart and you start finding all these sites buried up to 2 meters, including, the museums and this entire district, and also the buried underneath this car park. So I think it's all one event, but it's just being described away as many different things. And I just wanted to point out one last site in Australia, very close to Sydney, Australia. I think it's actually considered a suburb, but also a city, Parramatta. And there's an archaeological excavation going on at the northern edge of their central business district. And I think this site is going to be the home of I think it was a science and technology museum, but it's going to be a massive museum. But during excavations of this site, they did, one of the earlier parts of this site that they performed excavations on was this parking lot area. And they found, as they started digging down, they uncovered a brick structure that they associate with an industrial structure. But again, just buried, very similar to a lot of these other sites, but again, possibly dating between the 1820s and 1850s. So in Australia, they're finding all these sites that are buried, but you have different narratives for why they're buried, whether it's raising of the street levels or you're looking at a basement or just got buried. But at the end of the day, it's the same phenomenon, this very early colonial period, and they're putting it typically between 1820 and 1850. But I don't think the time frame is accurate. I think in reality, this happened at a much earlier point. And that might be the future of an upcoming video. But when I look at other sites, including in United States, like this early colonial period, Charleston, South Carolina, I've touched upon this, but there used to be this walled city with all these defensive fortifications. And now they're lying underneath these more historic structures. They're finding the buried remnants of these fortifications. And we're told that in Charleston, South Carolina, we're told that a large portion of these walls and fortifications were raised intentionally. And this was a dig in 2009 where they found this massive wall, which I think the portion that you can see below ground, I think it's 8.5 feet. But what we're told is that this would have extended a further 6 feet above the current ground level or grade. So we're talking over 14 feet. But again, so they just decided to raise this entire city basically and just cover over everything and build these new structures. Like something pretty significant, I think, happened. And I think there might be a correlation between the early colonial period in Australia and what we're seeing here in Charleston, South Carolina, even though the dates don't line up. And even if you look at the first settlement in New York, which was this Dutch settlement, used to be called New Amsterdam. You got buried walls that are 10 feet underneath Battery Park, and you had these buried structures that they found in the 1990s. We're given different explanations for all this, but at the end of the day, I think it's the same event, potentially. So I just wanted to share that because I think you can kind of see it a little more clearly when you're looking at all these examples from Australia. And I think it ties into some of these examples from the United States as well. So I think that's all I have for you today. There's a few more videos that I think I'm going to be making, tying a few more things together along these lines. So should be interesting, but I do want to give a big shout out to all my patrons. Thank you so much for all your help and assistance. Really appreciate it. And with that being said, I think I'll leave it here. So until next time, take care.